School Education by Charlotte Mason, Volume 3, Chapter 1, Docility and Authority in the Home and the School. Better relations between children and their elders. All of us who have accepted education as our métier are keenly alive to the signs of the times as they are to be read in the conduct and manners of children. Upon one thing, anyway, we may congratulate ourselves with unmixed satisfaction. The relations between children and parents, and indeed between children and their grown-up friends, generally are far more intimate, frank, and friendly than such relations used to be. There does not seem to be any longer that great gulf fixed between child thought and grown-up thought, which the older among us once tried to cross with frantic but vain efforts. The heads of the house, when we were little, were autocratic as the czars of all the Russias. We received everything at their hands, from bread and milk to mother's love, with more or less gratitude, but with invariable docility. If they had stubborn questionings as to whether was better for us, this or that, they kept them to themselves. For us, everything was decreed, and all decrees were final. There were rebellious children, perhaps, as 1 in a score or 1 in 100, but then these were rebellious with the fine courage of Milton's Satan. They dared everything and set themselves up in bold opposition. These were the open rebels who would, sooner or later, come to a bad end, so we were told, and so we secretly believed. For the others, there was no middle course. They were brought under rule, and that rule was arbitrary and without appeal. The elder generation of parents, autocratic. This is how children were brought up some 40 or 50 years ago, and even young parents of today have, in many cases, grown up under a regime, happy, loving, and wise, very likely, but before all things arbitrary. These were what the Scotch would call ill-guided homes, where the children did what was right in their own eyes. These will always exist so long as there are weak and indolent parents, unconcerned about their responsibilities. But the exceptions went to prove the rule, and the rule and tradition in most middle-class homes was that of well-ordered and governed childhood. Every biography that issues from the press of the men and women who made their mark during the first half of the century is a case in point. John Stuart Mill, Ruskin, the Lawrences, Tennyson, almost everyone who has made for himself a distinguished name grew up under a martinet rule. Only the other day we heard of an instance, the recollection of which had survived for 70 years. A boy of 12 or 13 had been out shooting rabbits. He came home in the early darkness of a bitterly cold winter evening. His father asked him by which gate he had entered the park. By such a gate? Did you shut it? I don't recollect. Go and see. And the boy went, though he was already tired out, and the gate in question was more than a mile from the house. Such an incident would scarcely happen today. The boy would protest, plead his own benumbed fatigue, and suggest that a man should be sent to shut the gate if, as it did not appear from the story, it was important that it should be shut at all. Yet this was a kind father, whom his children both loved and honored, but arbitrary rule and unquestioning obedience were the habits of the household. Nor is this notion of domestic government quite obsolete yet. I heard the other day of a Scotch father who confined his daughter of 18 to her room for a week on account of some by no means serious breach of discipline. The difference is that when you find an arbitrary parent now, he is a little out of touch with the thought and culture of the day, while a few decades ago, parents were arbitrary of set principle, and in proportion as they were cultivated and intelligent. Arbitrary rule not always a failure. It cannot be said that this arbitrary rule was entirely a failure. It turned out steadfast, capable, able, self-governed, gentle-mannered men and women. In our less hopeful moments, we wonder as we watch the children of our day whether they will prove as good stuff as their grandfathers and their fathers. But we need not fear. The evolution of educational thought is like the incoming of the tide. The wave comes and the wave goes, and you hardly know whether you are watching ebb or flow. But let an hour elapse, and then judge. But truer educational thought results in worthier character. After all allowances for ebb and flow, for failure here and mistake there, truer educational thought must of necessity result in an output of more worthy character. For one thing, this very arbitrariness rose from limitations. Parents knew that they must govern. Righteous Abraham, who ruled his house, was their example. And it is far easier to govern from a height, as it were, than from the intimacy of close personal contact. But you cannot be quite frank and easy with beings who are obviously of a higher and of another order than yourself. At least, you cannot when you are a little boy. And here we have one cause of the inscrutable reticence of children. At the best of times, they carry on the busy traffic of their own thoughts all to themselves. We can all recollect the pathetic misgivings of our childish days, which a word would have removed, but which formed the secret history of years in our lives. Mrs. Charles, in her autobiography, tells us how her childhood was haunted by a distressing dream. She dreamed that she had lost her mother and hunted for her in vain for hours in the rooms and endless corridors of a building unknown to her. Her distress was put down to fear of the dark, and she never told her tender mother of this trouble of the night. Probably no degree of loving intimacy will throw the closed doors of the child's nature permanently ajar, because, we may believe, the burden of the mystery of all this unintelligible world falls early upon the conscious soul, and each of us must beat out his own conception of life for himself. But it is much to a child to know that he may question, may talk of a thing that perplexes him, and that there is comprehension for his perplexities. Effusive sympathy is a mistake, and it bores the child when it does not make him feel silly. But just to know that you can ask and tell is a great outlet, and means to the parent the power of direction, and to the child free and natural development. Doctrine of the Infallible Reason. With the advance of one line of educational insight, we have, alas, to note the receding of another and a most important principle. Early in the century, authority was everything in the government of the home, and the docility of the children went without saying, that is, always excepting the few rebellious spirits. However little we may be aware of the fact, the direction of philosophic thought in England has had a great deal to do with the relations of parents and children in every home. 2 centuries ago, Locke promulgated the doctrine of the infallible reason. That doctrine accepted, individual reason becomes the ultimate authority, and every man is free to do that which is right in his own eyes. Provided, Locke would have added, that the reason be fully trained, and the mind instructed as to the merits of this particular case, but such proviso was readily lost sight of, and the broad principle remained. The old Puritanic faith and the elder traditions for the bringing up of children, as well as of Locke's own religious feelings and dutiful instincts, were too strong for the new philosophy in England. But in France there was a soil prepared for the seed. Locke was eagerly read because his opinions jumped with the thought of the hour. His principles were put into practice, his conclusions worked out to the bitter end, and thoughtful writers consider that this religious and cultivated English gentleman cannot be exonerated from a share of the guilt of the atrocities of the French Revolution. Leads to the dethronement of authority. We, in the 20th century, have lost some of the safeguards that held good in the 17th, and we have our own, perhaps greater philosopher who carries the teaching of Locke to the inevitable conclusion which the early thinker shirked. Mr. Herbert Spencer proclaims, as they did in France, the apotheosis of reason. He sees, as they saw in France, that the principle of the infallible reason is directly antagonistic to the idea of authority. He traces its last idea to its final source and justification. So long as men acknowledge a God, they of necessity acknowledge authority, supreme and deputed. But, says Mr. Spencer, in effect, every man finds his own final authority in his own reason. This philosopher has the courage of his convictions. He perceives, as they did in France, that the enthronement of the human reason is the dethronement of Almighty God. He teaches, by processes of exhaustive reasoning, that we sit unowned upon our burial sod, and know not whence we come, nor whose we be. From the dethronement of the divine follows the dethronement of all human authority, whether it be of kings or deputies over nations, or of parents over families. Every act of authority is, we are taught, an infringement of the rights of man or of child. Children are to be brought up from their own, first self-directed, doing that which is right in their own eyes, governed by the reason which is to be trained by experience of right and wrong in the choosing of the right course. Life has its penalties for those who transgress the laws of reason, and the child should be permitted to learn these laws through the intervention of these penalties. But thou shalt and thou shalt not are to be eliminated from the vocabulary of parents. So complete and detailed is Mr. Spencer's scheme for the emancipation of children from rule that he objects to the study of languages on the ground that the rules of grammar are a transgression of the principle of liberty. Authority not inherent but deputed. Mr. Spencer's work on education is so valuable a contribution to educational thought that many parents read it and embrace it as a whole without perceiving that it is a part, and a carefully worked out part, of a scheme of philosophy with which perhaps they are little in sympathy. They accept the philosopher's teaching when he bids them bring up children without authority in order to give them free room for self-development, without perceiving or perhaps knowing that it is the labor of the author's life to eliminate the idea of authority from the universe, that he repudiates the authority of parents because it is a link in the chain which binds the universe to God. For it is indeed true that none of us has a right to exercise authority in things great or small, except as we are, and acknowledge ourselves to be, deputed by the one supreme and ultimate authority. When we take up this volume on education, small as it is, easy reading as it is, we must bear in mind that we have put ourselves under the lead of a philosopher who overlooks nothing, who regards the least important thing from the standpoint of their final issue, and who would not have the little child do as he is bid, lest he should learn as a man to obey that authority other than himself, which we believe to be divine. You can find the second half of this chapter in the next video, marked 1b.